"You don't belong here." That was the first thing he said to me. Have you ever walked into a room full of people you've known your whole life and still felt like a stranger? That's how I felt when I arrived at my uncle's house in Omaha for my father's memorial. It wasn't just the grief or the exhaustion. It was the way they looked at me, like I was intruding. I'm Victoria. I'm 33 now, but at the time I was just a daughter trying to keep it together after losing the one person who ever truly stood by me, my dad, Greg. We weren't close to the rest of the family. Growing up in Lincoln, it was mostly just the two of us. My mom left when I was 5, and the rest of Dad's side, well, let's just say I always knew they saw me as different. But what I didn't know, what I never expected, was that they'd erase me entirely. When I walked in that day, my cousin Jared was the first to speak. He barely looked up from his drink when he muttered, "Didn't expect to see you here, Victoria." "I'm his daughter," I said, trying to stay calm. "Where," he snapped, "you were his daughter." The room went quiet. You know that kind of silence where everyone hears it but no one says anything? Then my Uncle Richard, Pizza Dad's older brother, stood up. "Victoria," he said, like he was scolding a child, "let's not make this about you. This is about family." That word hit me like a slap. Family. As if I wasn't. As if I hadn't just buried my father. What came next broke me. Richard cleared his throat and said, "We've gone over your father's wishes. There's no mention of you in the will. I'm sorry." I blinked, thinking I misheard. "What do you mean, no mention of me?" "He left everything to Jared and me," Richard said coldly. "The house, the land, the equipment. You weren't listed." "But that's not possible," I said, shaking. "He would never. He promised me." "I don't know what you were told," Richard cut in. "But there's no room for bitterness here. Greg made his decisions. The worst part? No one said a word in my defense, not one person. It was like they were all in on it. I walked out of that house in the middle of winter with no coat, no answers, and no clue what I was going to do. But I knew one thing. They thought I'd disappear quietly. They were wrong. He changed the will after his stroke. But why? What kind of father leaves his only daughter out of his will? That question haunted me for weeks after the memorial. I kept trying to make sense of it because none of it added up. Dad had a stroke 2 years before he passed. It wasn't a massive one, but it changed him. He got quieter, more forgetful, and definitely more vulnerable. I was there through it all. Doctor's appointments, medication routines, physical therapy. Richard and Jared, they never showed up once. Not even a phone call. So how did they end up with everything? I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying old conversations, trying to remember if Dad had hinted at anything, and then it hit me. 6 months before he died, he told me he was updating his will. He said, "Vic, I want to make sure you're taken care of. You've always been the one looking out for me." So why would a man who said that suddenly cut me out? I started digging, quietly. I called the attorney's office that handled the estate. A woman named Denise answered. At first, she was formal and curt, probably thinking I was just another bitter relative. But then I dropped Dad's full name and mentioned the stroke. That's when her tone shifted. "I'm sorry," she said. "That file's been sealed since final signing. Mr. Richard Hayes and Mr. Jared Hayes are the listed parties." I asked her when the will was changed. "About a year ago," she said. "That was after the stroke. And that's when I knew. Something wasn't right. The version of the will they were waving around wasn't the one Dad told me about. I remembered him saying he was going to leave me the farmhouse and part of the back lot, land his own father left him. We'd even walked the perimeter together and talked about what I could build there. So how did that turn into me getting nothing? I drove down to the county records office, hoping for answers, but ran into dead ends. Everything filed was under Richard's name. No original will, no revisions, just a final document submitted 3 weeks after Dad's death. My gut told me there was more to this. Then, one night, I got a text from an old family friend, Sharon, who used to help Dad with groceries. She'd heard what happened at the memorial. "I don't want to get involved," she wrote. But Greg was worried near the end, said someone was pressuring him about documents. "Look in his barn, top shelf, behind the feed sacks." That was the first thread, and I was about to pull it. I didn't know exactly what I'd find, but if they thought they could rewrite history and get away with it, they had no idea who they were messing with. You're listening to a story on the Family Revenge Stories channel. If this story resonates with you or reminds you of something you've been through, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you won't miss our daily stories. The secret folder behind the feed sacks. What would you do if your father's truth was buried in a dusty barn? The next morning, I drove back to Dad's old place. It felt strange pulling into the gravel driveway, knowing it technically wasn't mine anymore. At least not on paper. Jared had already started talking about tearing it down, turning it into a modern rental space. He called it progress. I called it theft. The barn was just like I remembered it. Weathered, creaky, still smelling like hay and motor oil. I climbed up into the loft, brushing past old storage boxes, tools, and sacks of feed. My heart was pounding. Top shelf, behind the feed sacks. I pulled out 3 bags and shoved them aside, and there it was, a dusty blue folder wedged into the corner. I didn't even sit down. I flipped it open right there on the floor, my hands shaking. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, letters, receipts, and a printed document that said, "Last Will and Testament, Gregory Allen Hayes, dated March 3rd, 2023. I checked the date again and again. This was before the will Richard filed, by nearly 8 months. And right there in black ink was my name. I leave the farmhouse and surrounding 10 acres to my daughter, Victoria Hayes. Tears welled up in my eyes. I wasn't crazy. Dad hadn't forgotten me. He hadn't turned his back on me. He wanted me to have it. I was his family. So why did no one else seem to know about this? I took the entire folder and drove straight to the law office where Denise worked. She wasn't expecting me, but I didn't give her a chance to brush me off. "I need you to look at this," I said, spreading the documents across her desk. Her eyes scanned the pages. "Where did you get this?" "My dad's barn, hidden, on purpose." She flipped to the signature page and narrowed her eyes. "These signatures. That's him. And look. 2 witnesses. These are valid." "Then why wasn't this the will that was filed?" She looked uneasy. "I wasn't the attorney of record on the final filing. That was handled directly through Mr. Richard Hayes' representative. I assumed it was updated again, but if this one's newer..." Her voice trailed off, and I could feel it. This wasn't over. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a cover-up. The next thing she said hit me like a lightning bolt. "You need a probate attorney, fast. This version of the will could change everything." That night, I sat in my car outside the farmhouse, my farmhouse, and stared up at the sky. They thought I'd never fight back. But now, I had something more powerful than revenge. I had proof. They called me a liar, so I brought a lawyer. What do you do when your own family calls you a fraud? I'll never forget the look on Jared's face when he opened the door and saw me standing there. He gave me that smug half-smile he always wore when he thought he was in control. "You lost, Vic," he said, blocking the doorway. "No," I replied, holding up a manila envelope. "But you're about to be." Inside was a formal letter from my newly retained probate attorney, Leah Carter. Sharp, experienced, and not afraid of men like Richard and Jared. The letter stated that we were contesting the will they submitted and that a newer version, one naming me as a beneficiary, had been discovered. "You're joking," Jared laughed, skimming the first page. "What'd you do, forge it in Microsoft Word?" I clenched my jaw. "It's real. Signed, witnessed, and dated after the one you filed." He tossed the envelope onto the porch like it was garbage. "You're wasting everyone's time. There's no way Dad left you anything. You were barely around. You were never part of the family." There it was again. That word. Family. Like it was some exclusive club and I hadn't paid the membership fee. But I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because 2 days later, Jared and Richard got hit with a formal notice from the county probate court. The estate had been reopened pending a hearing. And suddenly, I wasn't just the girl they ignored. I was the legal challenge standing between them and the inheritance they thought they'd stolen clean. The pushback came fast. Prince Richard's lawyer called mine and said I was making a desperate and embarrassing attempt to exploit a grieving family. They tried to question the will's legitimacy, claimed Dad wasn't in the right state of mind, said he had been easily manipulated. By me. But Leah was ready. She dug up medical records from Dad's doctors confirming his mental clarity at the time of the will's signing. She even tracked down one of the witnesses, an old friend of Dad's named Hank, who worked at the local hardware store. "I remember that day clear as anything," Hank said during our prep call. Greg was sharp. He said he needed to fix something that was long overdue. Turns out, I wasn't the only one Dad had confided in. He had told Hank, too, that he feared Jared and Richard would try to take everything. That lit a fire in me I didn't know I had. They had tried to erase me, rewrite my father's wishes, paint me as some outsider. But now I had a voice. And a team. And I was going to make sure the court heard everything. The first hearing was scheduled for the following month. They had power. I had truth. You're listening to a story on the Family Revenge Stories channel. If this story resonates with you or reminds you of something you've been through, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you won't miss our daily stories. They thought it was just paper. The judge thought otherwise. How do you fight someone who thinks they're untouchable? I walked into that courtroom in downtown Lincoln with my heart pounding and palms sweating. Jared and Richard were already seated, dressed like saints in matching navy suits. They barely looked at me. But I didn't care, because I wasn't there to win their approval. I was there to defend my father's last wishes. The judge, an older woman named Judge Franklin, was no nonsense from the start. She asked for opening statement, and Leah stood confidently beside me. "Your Honor," she began, "we are contesting the validity of the will submitted by the respondents on the basis that a more recent, properly executed will exists, one that was kept hidden deliberately from the court." Richard's attorney immediately objected. "There is no evidence that our clients knowingly concealed anything. If anything, this is a baseless accusation from someone looking for a payout." I could feel my blood boil. A payout? I didn't want money. I wanted what was mine, what my father intended for me. Judge Franklin raised a hand. "You'll have your turn. Continue, Ms. Carter." We submitted the folder I found in the barn as Exhibit A. The judge reviewed the dates, the witness signatures, the attached statements from Hank and Sharon, both confirming Dad's state of mind and his clear intent to leave me the land and house. Then came the bombshell. Leah introduced an email we'd recovered during discovery. One sent from Jared to a family acquaintance just days after Dad passed. The subject line? "Gotta get the paperwork in before she starts asking questions." When it was read aloud in court, you could hear a pin drop. Richard's face turned red. Jared tried to claim it was about funeral plans, but no one bought it, not even their own lawyer. The judge asked for clarification. "Mr. Hayes," she said, turning to Jared, "can you explain what paperwork you were referring to?" He stumbled. "Just, basic estate stuff." She leaned forward. "Before a will had even been submitted?" No answer. That's when I felt it, that subtle shift in the room, the one that told me things were starting to turn. For so long, I'd felt like I was yelling into the void, trying to prove I belonged, that my father hadn't forgotten me. But now, my voice was being heard, loud and clear. The hearing didn't end in a ruling that day, but Judge Franklin issued an order to temporarily freeze all estate activity. No property sales, no account access, until the matter was resolved. That was the first time I saw panic on Jared's face. They thought it was just paper, some forgotten folder in a barn. But to the court and to me, it was everything. He said I wasn't family, but he left me a letter. What would you give to hear one last message from someone you loved? A week after the hearing, I got a call from Sharon, the same neighbor who tipped me off about the folder in the barn. "Victoria," she said gently, "I found something. I should have given it to you sooner, but I wasn't sure if it was my place." She handed me a small envelope, yellowed and sealed with tape. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. I recognized the curve of the V immediately. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could open it. My fingers trembled, my heart raced. When I finally pulled the letter out, the ink was slightly faded, but his words were still strong. "Vic, if you're reading this, then it means I didn't get to explain everything the way I wanted. I know things might get messy after I'm gone. I've seen the way Richard and Jared circle like vultures. But I want you to know something, without a shred of doubt. You are my daughter. You are my family. And I want you to have the house because it was always meant to be yours. Not just the land, but the peace it gave me. I want you to have that. I'm sorry I didn't protect you better from the rest of them. But I'm proud of the woman you are. Love, Dad." I sat there, crying in the parking lot of a grocery store, clutching that letter like it was oxygen. It wasn't just validation, it was everything. I took the letter straight to Leah. She was cautious at first. Emotional pieces like that don't always hold legal weight. But after reading it, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This speaks volumes, especially about intent." The next court session was scheduled for the following week, and this time we had something even stronger than documents. We had his voice. In court, Leah submitted the letter as supplemental evidence. Richard's lawyer tried to dismiss it as emotional manipulation, but the judge disagreed. "In probate, intent matters," Judge Franklin said sternly, "and this letter strongly suggests the decedent's wishes were aligned with the contested will." The tide had officially turned. I looked over at Jared. Gone was the smugness. Gone was the superiority. Now he looked worried. Because despite all their power plays, backroom conversations, and manipulation, there was one thing they couldn't erase. The truth. My father did want me in his will. He wanted me to have that land, that house, that legacy. And now finally it wasn't just my word against theirs. It was his. You're listening to a story on the Family Revenge Stories channel. If this story resonates with you or reminds you of something you've been through, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you won't miss our daily stories. The will was real, but so was their desperation. What happens when people who always had power realize they're about to lose it? After the judge accepted Dad's letter as supplemental evidence, everything changed. The courtroom dynamic flipped. Richard and Jared, who once acted like they owned the place, now looked like two men standing on a sinking ship. And that's when the desperation kicked in. First, they tried to settle. Richard's attorney reached out to Leah with a proposal. They'd generously offer me a cash payout in exchange for dropping the challenge. It was less than the value of the land, way less, and they threw in language about keeping things quiet. Leah read it, then looked at me. "Your call, but in my opinion this is a sign they know they're losing." I didn't even need a second to think. "I'm not settling," I said. "They didn't just try to take land, they tried to erase me." And that was the moment I stopped playing defense. So they switched tactics. Suddenly, Richard was calling old family members, trying to turn people against me, saying I was manipulating the court and only after money. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years started messaging me weird, passive-aggressive things like, "Sad what you're doing to the family name." But I stayed quiet, focused, determined. Because while they were gossiping, I was building a case. Leah had filed a motion to compel a digital search of the family attorney's communications. And what we found next blew everything wide open. There were emails. Real time-stamped emails showing Richard instructing the attorney to disregard any prior drafts of my father's will. One of them even said, "No need to confuse the court with old documents. We've got what we need." That was it, the nail in the coffin. When Judge Franklin reviewed the emails, her tone went from neutral to sharp. "I see now that there may have been intentional suppression of valid estate documents," she said. "That constitutes serious grounds for probate fraud." And suddenly, Richard and Jared weren't just losing a house. They were staring down potential criminal charges. I'll never forget that moment in the courtroom when Jared stood up and tried to speak. "We didn't mean to," Dad said, he stammered. But the judge stopped him cold. "You don't speak for the deceased," she said. "The documents and the letter do." And right there, in front of everyone, the judge ordered the estate frozen pending full reassignment under the valid will. The one that named me. They had underestimated me. They thought I'd go away quietly. But I fought with everything I had. And now, for the first time since Dad died, I could breathe. He said I wasn't family, but now I own the estate. What's justice supposed to feel like? Because standing on the porch of the farmhouse with the keys in my hand, I didn't feel victorious. I felt peaceful. It took nearly a year of court battles, threats, slander, and painful memories, but the probate judge's final ruling was clear. My father's last will, the real one, was to be honored in full. That meant the house, the land, the equipment, the tools. It was all mine. The courtroom was dead silence when Judge Franklin gave her decision. Richard didn't even look at me. Jared stormed out. And honestly, I didn't need their reaction. I didn't need them to admit what they did, because they no longer had the power to define my worth. For so long, they told me I wasn't family, that I didn't belong, but the truth is I was the only one who actually showed up when it mattered. I was the one by my father's side when he could barely speak. I was the one who fed him, cleaned his wounds, read him the mail. Family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty. And Dad knew that. That's why he left it to me. Not just the property, but the legacy. A few weeks after the final ruling, I moved into the farmhouse full-time. The first night was hard. I sat at the kitchen table, half expecting him to walk in. Instead, I poured a glass of his favorite bourbon and opened the letter he wrote me one more time. "I want you to have the peace this place gave me." That line stayed with me. So, I started restoring the house. Not out of obligation, but out of gratitude. I rebuilt the porch, refinished the wood floors. I even turned the old barn into a workshop for a local youth program. Because this place isn't just mine now. It's his memory living on through me. As for Richard and Jared, they vanished after the ruling. No apology, no phone call. And I'm fine with that. Because the truth is, I didn't need their approval. I never did. The girl they tried to erase? The outsider? The daughter they said wasn't family? She now owns the entire estate. And more importantly, she owns her voice. If you've ever been told you don't belong, I'm here to say, you do. And no matter how hard they try to write you out of the story, you always have the power to write yourself back in. You're listening to a story on the Family Revenge Stories channel. If this story resonates with you or reminds you of something you've been through, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you won't miss our daily stories.